Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents, a folklore podcast where I read you to sleep or until the next story. I'm your host, Dustin. Today we are back in Nigeria with the Yoruba legends of M.I. Ogumefu. In the first story, we learn why beautiful birds have quiet voices. In the second, we learn about a great flowing river and a stagnant pool. And in the third story, we learn the sad tale of Isokun, who just can't seem to have a baby. Okay, let's begin. The Voices of Birds. A magician once passed through a grove in the forest, where a great many brown birds fluttered from tree to tree and filled the air with their songs. For a long time he sat and listened, enraptured by their beautiful melodies. But in the end, he became very jealous, for he himself could not sing. At last, he felt that he must by some means or other possess the voices of these singing birds. So he called them all together and said, "It grieves me that the gods have given you all such poor, ugly, brown feathers. How happy you would be if you were brilliantly colored with red, blue, orange, and green." And the birds agreed that it was a great pity to be so ugly. The magician then suggested that by means of his charms, he could give them all beautiful feathers in exchange for their voices, which were, after all, of very little use to them, since nobody came to the grove to hear them. The birds thought over his words and desired very much the beauty he promised them, so they foolishly agreed to give him their voices, which the magician placed all together inside a large calabash. Then he used his charms to turn the dull brown feathers of the birds into orange and green and red, and they were very pleased. The magician hurried away, and as soon as he came to a deserted place, he opened the calabash and swallowed its contents. From that day on, he had an exceedingly sweet voice, and people came from far and near to listen to his songs. But the birds were satisfied with their bright feathers, and this is why the most beautiful birds are quite unable to sing. The end. Okay, and story number 2, The Three Magicians. A certain king had engaged in a series of wars, during which he employed 3 magicians or medicine men to make charms for him so that he might destroy his enemies. At the end of the war, these 3 magicians came to the king and humbly asked to be allowed to return home. The king foolishly refused, and at this the magicians said, "We asked your permission out of courtesy, O king, but we can still very easily depart without it." Thereupon the first magician fell down on the ground and disappeared. The second threw a ball of twine into the air, climbed up the thread, and disappeared likewise. The third magician, Elenri, remained standing. "It is your turn to disappear," said the king, trembling with anger, "or I will slay you." "You cannot harm me," replied the magician. At this the king ordered him to be beheaded, but the sword broke in two, and the executioner's arm withered away. Then the king ordered him to be speared, but the spear crumpled up and it was useless. An attempt was made to crush the magician with a rock, but it rolled over his body as lightly as a child's ball. The king then sent for the magician's wife and asked her to reveal his secret charm. At last the woman confessed that if they took one blade of grass from the thatched roof of a house, they could easily cut off his head with it. This was done, and the magician's head rolled off and stuck to the king's hand. It could not by any means be removed. When food or drink was brought to the king, the head consumed it all, so that the king seemed likely to die. Magicians were hastily summoned from all over the kingdom, but the head laughed at all their charms and remained fast. Finally came one who prostrated himself before the head and cried out, "Who am I to oppose you, great Elenri? I come only because the king commands me." To this Elenri replied, "You are wiser than all the rest," and the head fell at once to the ground, where it became a flowing river, which to this day is called Odo Elenri, or Elenri's River. The magician's wife was likewise changed into a river, but because she had betrayed him, Elenri commanded the river not to flow, and it became instead a stagnant pool. The end. Okay, and story number 3, Isokun and the Baby. A certain King Dekun had a wife named Isokun, who bore him no children, on which account there was great unhappiness in the palace. One day Isokun disappeared and was absent for many weeks, and though search was made, no trace of her could be found. The truth was that Isokun had set out to visit the shrines of all the gods, in the hope that one of them would promise her a child. But though she traveled far and wide, the gods of all the trees and streams and rocks refused her prayer. When she was at last nearing home again, she came upon a poor woman asleep by the wayside with her 2-day-old baby. Isokun stole the baby and hastened to the palace, where she informed the king that she had disappeared in order to give him a joyous surprise of his little son. There were great rejoicings in the palace, sacrifices were made, and the drums beat loudly. Meanwhile, the real mother awoke and discovered that her own baby had been stolen. She ran into the town distracted and insisted on searching every house, but without success. At last she came to the palace and insisted on entering there also, which was possible at that moment because all were celebrating the arrival of the king's heir. At this time the baby cried with hunger, and as Isokun could not feed him, she invited other reasons for the crying and sought in vain to pacify him without arousing suspicion. Drawn by the cries, the mother entered and snatched the baby to her breast, where it was at once contented. In a few moments the deception was made clear, and the mother departed with her child, and Isokun, ashamed and fearing anger of the king, fled from the palace and never returned. The end. As far as storytelling goes, I really like that first one. It could be made to kind of open up a storytelling thing. Oh, I gave the birds their beautiful things, but they gave me their beautiful voice. The second one, I kind of like the head getting stuck to the king's hand and just being a real pain in the butt. And, of course, the wife betraying him, yeah. And stagnant pool and all that, but still, pretty cool wizard story. And the third one, Isokun was just, you can't feed the baby. What are you doing? Don't snatch people's babies. Okay, and the podcast shoutout is to the British History Podcast. This podcast is already huge, so it won't see any sort of 2-listener bump from the Sandman shoutout. But gosh darn it, this is a really good podcast. Jamie and producer Z do a great job of pointing out what we know, how we know it, what the gaps in the knowledge are, and what the biases of the writers of history are. It is a full-on history course. I've been a free listener for a long time, but their membership sounds very worth it. It's British history from prehistory up until about 1066 at this point. It's a great listen, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it too. Go listen and review and subscribe and all that goodness. And the listener shoutout is to Vega Alta, Puerto Rico. Located on the north side of the island, Vega Alta was nicknamed the City of Squatters because the people would squat there to wait for the train. Taino was the indigenous language of the land until the Spanish overtook it, and Lin-Manuel Miranda has roots in the city, and my friend Levon also has roots in the island. For some reason, Anchor gives Puerto Rico stats separate from American ones. So, I've got listeners in America and Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico is America. Anyway, I would love to go there and see the beauty of the Caribbean. Thank you, and good night.